The Lord be with you. A reading from the Gospel of Q. John the Baptist was in prison when he heard what Jesus was doing. He sent two of his own disciples to ask him, "Are you the one who is to come, or should we wait for another?" Jesus answered, "Go back and tell John what you hear and see. The blind see again, the lame walk, lepers are made clean, the deaf hear, the dead are raised to life, and the poor are given good news. Blessed is the person who does not lose faith in me." After John's disciples had departed, Jesus spoke to them and to the crowds about John. "What did you go out to the desert to see? A reed shaken by the wind? No. Then what did you go out to see? A man dressed in fine clothes? Those who wear fine clothes live in luxury in royal palaces. But what did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and much more than a prophet. He is the one about whom it is written, 'See, I send my messenger before you. He will prepare the road ahead of you.' I tell you, of all the children born of women, no one is greater than John the Baptist. Yet the least in the kingdom of God is greater than John." Up until the time of John the Baptist, we had the law of Moses and the words of the prophets. Since John arrived, the good news about God's realm has been announced. Now people everywhere are pushing to get in. How should I describe the people of this generation? What are they like? They are like children who sit in the marketplace and call to one another, "We played the flute for you, and you didn't dance. We sang sad songs, and you wouldn't weep." Because John the Baptist came neither eating nor drinking, and they call him a madman. The Son of Man comes eating and drinking, and you say, "Look, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and outcasts." But wisdom is being proved right by her own children. The Gospel of the Lord. There are few topics of more interest to Christian New Agers or to esotericists in general when they think about Jesus than the notion of the lost years. What happened to Jesus between age 12 and age 30? So for instance, when you read the very first gospel, the Gospel of Mark, written about 70 AD, Mark begins his whole story when Jesus is 30 years of age. When you get to Matthew's Gospel, written about 10 years later, Matthew adds the birth stories, the conception of Jesus and the birth of Jesus. And then after his infancy, nothing happens until age 30. So there's this huge gap. In Matthew's Gospel, is 30-year gap. By the time you get to Luke, Luke fills in one more incident. So Luke talks about the conception and the infancy of Jesus, and then there's one other incident at age 12 where Jesus gets lost in the temple and is debating with the wise people in the temple. And then there's nothing from age 12 to age 30 in Luke's Gospel. In John's Gospel, John has no infancy whatsoever. John talks about the pre-incarnational Jesus, the Logos, and then goes straight into Jesus at age 30 at the Jordan. And so what happened in these years from 12 to 30? It's occupied the imagination of Christians and esotericists for a long, long time. And so we filled in the gaps with wishful thinking and with some kind of scholarship. And so according to this, Jesus spent time in Tibet. There's a belief system that there was a great saint called Saint Issa, I-S-S-A, that appears in Tibetan folklore around the time when Jesus would have been alive. There's a belief system that he spent time with the Celtic Druids in Glastonbury. And there's a belief system that he spent time in the mystery schools of Egypt. So we fill in these ourselves. And how do we do it? Sometimes it's just fanciful thinking, and sometimes it's the recognition of archetypal material. We begin to realize that when you study all of the other great wisdom traditions, that there are motifs and archetypes that keep reappearing. So the same kinds of things that happened in the life of Jesus, like for instance, the death-resurrection motif, this is something that happens in many different great wisdom traditions, not just in the Christian one. So you begin to ask, what's that about? Or you begin to think about, for instance, the notion of Jesus feeding us from his own body and blood. That's a motif that you find in many great wisdom traditions, that the gods literally feed us from themselves. Or you begin to look at the teachings and the parallels between the teaching of Jesus and the teaching of some other great avatars. For instance, the first time you come across Buddhism and you look at the Eightfold Path and you compare it to the Eight Beatitudes, there's extraordinary overlap between these two. So people fill it in from scholarship and from wishful thinking. They want to know what Jesus was about in those periods of time. There's one other explanation for it that's not so popular, but it's the notion that Jesus and John the Baptist spent these years together in the desert as Essenes, that they were fellow Essenes. And since John the Baptist is the main theme for the third reading today from the Gospel of Q, that's what I want to focus on today. And I'm going to make 5 main points. I'm going to talk firstly about what was the relationship between Jesus and John the Baptist. And then secondly, John's question today and Jesus' answer today. Thirdly, what did Jesus have to say about John after John's disciples had gone back? Fourthly, I'm going to talk about what I consider to be the inner meaning of Jesus' response to John today. And then fifthly, I'm going to talk about what does recovery of sight to the blind look like in the 21st century. So they're the 5 points I'll make this morning. For the first one, I want to look then at what do the scriptures tell us about the relationship between Jesus and John the Baptist. And when you read the scriptures, particularly the 4 Gospels, it's all over the place. You look at Mark's Gospel, and in Mark's Gospel, there's just a single encounter between Jesus and John the Baptist. The life story of Jesus begins with Jesus being baptized by John the Baptist. So in a sense, the only relationship that exists between them in Mark's Gospel is that of disciple to guru. John being the guru and Jesus being the disciple. Jesus goes down to be baptized by John in the Jordan. So in Mark's account, it's a disciple-guru relationship. That's pretty much what Mark has to say about it. When you get to Matthew's Gospel, it's a little bit more complicated because Matthew gives totally contradictory piece of information about the relationship. In chapter 3 of Matthew's Gospel, Jesus and John are meeting for the first time. And Jesus goes down into the Jordan to be baptized by John, and John recognizes him, immediately recognizes him. He says, no. We got it wrong way around. There's something wrong with this picture. It is you who should be baptizing me. And Jesus says, let it be. Let's do it this way. And then as he's baptizing Jesus, the Spirit comes down, and in many traditions, that is when Jesus the carpenter achieves Christ consciousness. So this is a radical transformation of a man who previously had been a really good man and basically a carpenter, living with his family and not making waves. And now there's a huge shift, and now Jesus had put on Christ consciousness. So that's what happens in Matthew's Gospel chapter 3. But in Matthew's Gospel in chapter 11, there's a totally different relationship between them. John is now in prison, and he's hearing reports about this character called Jesus from Nazareth. And he's wondering, could this be the Mashiach? But he's not sure. Now, this is very, very different from chapter 3, where John immediately recognized Jesus was the guy. Now in chapter 11, he has no idea who Jesus is, and he's wondering, could this possibly be the Messiah? So he sends out his own disciples to ask him, are you the one we've been waiting for? Or do we need to keep waiting some time longer? And so when you look through in Matthew's Gospel, there's a very different notion of relationship. First there's the recognition, and then there's, I have no idea who this person is. When you look at Luke's Gospel, Luke has them be cousins. You know the great story in Luke chapter 1, where Elizabeth, the cousin of Mary, gets pregnant in her old age with who will become John the Baptist. And then Mary goes down to greet her. Mary now is pregnant herself. And the two babies recognize each other in utero. And Elizabeth says, as soon as your greeting sounded in my ears, the babe in my womb leaped for joy. It was almost like Jesus was giving John Shaktipat, to use a Hindu term. It's like the Christ consciousness in Jesus suddenly hit John in utero, and John, before he was born, got it as well. So in Luke's Gospel, they're cousins, and presumably they would have met each other many, many times over the subsequent years. So according to Luke, it's a very different relationship. You get to John's Gospel, the last of the Gospels written, about the year 100 perhaps, and John is baptizing in the Jordan, and Jesus is passing by just minding his own business, and all of a sudden John says, that's him, that's him. Oh, hold up there, that's the guy. You've been waiting for the Messiah. And he says to his own disciples, and the two that are present right then are Andrew, the brother of Peter, and John, the brother of James. He says, that's the guy, go follow him. And they run after Jesus, and Jesus looks back, and there's these two guys, strangers, following him. And he says, Yeah? And they're kind of locked, they're stuck for a word. What are you going to say? They say, where do you live? And he says, come and see. And that's a phrase that has very many different levels. Come and see. He wasn't just going to show him his pad. He was going to show them his state of consciousness. And so they come. So in John's Gospel, John the Baptist recognizes Jesus spontaneously and points him out as the Messiah. So in many different traditions, the relationship between John and Jesus is very different. So you have to take your pick among them. Which is the one that rings true for you? Is it guru-disciple? Are they strangers to each other? Are they cousins? Or what was the relationship between John and Jesus? Brings me to my second point. In this account then today, we took it from the Gospel of Q. There's a longer account in the Gospel of Matthew. In Matthew in chapter 11, John sends out his disciples because he's been hearing about this Jesus character. He's been hearing about his miracles and he's been hearing about his teachings. And he's not sure whether this in fact is the Mashiach for whom they had been waiting. So he sends two of his own disciples to ask Jesus, are you the Mashiach? Are you what we've been waiting for 750 years? Or should we be waiting for somebody else? And Jesus' answer proves to me that he had spent time with the Celts. Because he doesn't answer the question. He beats around the bush. The Celts will never give you a straight answer. He doesn't say yes and he doesn't say no. He goes into a long explanation. Only an Irishman or a Celt would do that. No point in just using one word like yes or no when you could use 100 words. And so Jesus answers in code. Now there's a reason as well for the code. If he were to say, I am the Messiah, there would immediately be religious problems with the religious authorities and secular problems with the political authorities. So he answers in code. And the code was a statement that comes out of the book of Isaiah. Isaiah is the first person in the Jewish scriptures to talk about the Mashiach. And Isaiah was prophesying about 742 years before the birth of Jesus Christ. And there are many different references to it, but the most famous is the one where, speaking of the Messiah, Isaiah says this, I have come to preach good news to the poor, liberty to captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to set prisoners free, and to declare a year of favor from the Lord. So that was the code, 5 lines of code. And he says, now go back and tell John what you see. So that was his answer. Now John would have immediately twigged it. The secular authorities might not have picked up on it, but John certainly would recognize this was the job description of the Mashiach when he came. I will come to give sight, to preach good news to the poor, liberty to captives, recovery of sight to the blind, set prisoners free, and declare a year of favor from the Lord. So John had his answer. Jesus had given his answer. That's my second point. The third point then is, the disciples of John go back to report this, and Jesus begins to speak to the crowds about John, and he says to them, what did you guys go out into the desert to see when you were following John the Baptist? Because many of the disciples of Jesus originally had been followers of John. And he said to them, what did you go out into the desert to see? Was it like a reed shaking in the wind? In other words, a politician who was going to go whatever way the wind was moving? Or some kind of a diplomat? Or some kind of a preacher who during the week sent out a questionnaire to find out, what would you like me to talk about and what views would you like me to express? It wasn't like that with John. John knew what his truth was and he spoke his truth. So he says, that's not what you went out to see. You didn't go to see somebody just waving in the wind, or you didn't go to see somebody dressed in fine clothes. You went to hear a prophet. I tell you, not just a prophet. Since the beginning, there has been no man born of woman greater than John the Baptist. And then, as only Jesus can, he pulled the rug out totally from underneath it. There has been no man born of woman greater than John the Baptist. And yet, the least in the kingdom is greater than John. Just when you think that John is the guy, the go-to guy, and that we should all rush off and follow John right now, Jesus says, the least in the kingdom is greater than John. Not just anybody, but even the least in the kingdom is greater than John. Now, what in God's name is he on about? To understand what he meant, you have to do an evolutionary developmental look at the history of Judaism. And I want to divide it up into just 3 phases: pre-Moses, Moses, and post-Moses. Moses flourished about 1250 BC. Before that time, there was no law, in a sense. So revenge was the order of the day. So there's a great story, for instance, about a character in the Bible called Lamech. Lamech is the 6th generation from Adam. And Lamech had 2 wives. And in Genesis chapter 5, in verse 23, here's what Lamech says to his wives. He says, "Wives of Lamech, listen up. I have killed a man for wounding me. I have killed a boy for bruising me." So Lamech is actually the first serial killer in Scripture. Cain is the first murderer. Lamech is the first serial killer. I killed a man for wounding me, and I killed a boy for bruising me. So this is a way before the time of Moses. So the law of the land was just revenge, vendetta. So you wound me, I kill you. You bruise me, I kill you. Moses represented a huge shift in human morality and human ethical thinking. Moses said, no, you can't do it like that. An eye for an eye. Now we look back at an eye for an eye, we think that's terrible. How archaic, how vicious. It represented a huge shift in human ethical thinking. Moses saying, no, you can't kill a guy for wounding you, and you can't kill a boy for bruising you. An eye for an eye. In other words, the response has to be commensurate with the action that precipitated it. So Moses represents this huge move forward, and Moses gives them a code law. It stabilizes the whole society. Instead of now 12 fractured, warring tribes, you have a unified people. So Moses made a huge contribution to world thinking and to Jewish thinking. But 1250 years after Moses, they're stuck merely with legalism. Now the Pharisees will try to tweak it a little bit by adding OCD to law. So it's not just enough that you have 613 precepts, you have to keep them in the most minute detail. So they will add a total kind of obsessive compulsive disorder to the keeping of law. And it won't work, obviously. John the Baptist will add another wrinkle to it, and that wrinkle will be you got to keep the law, and then you have to be radically ascetical as well. And John was thinking that by radical asceticism, you could become holy. And so they're each tweaking it a bit. So when Jesus says, "Since the beginning there has never been born of woman a man greater than John the Baptist," if salvation consists in keeping law and being ascetical, nobody has ever done it better than John the Baptist. But that was for the time of Moses. This is no longer the time of Moses. And so the least in the kingdom is greater than John, because we've moved beyond legalism, and we've moved beyond OCD plus legalism, and we've moved beyond asceticism plus legalism into a new era. And this brings me to my fourth point. The inner meaning of Jesus' response to John today. And as I said, Jesus indicated that there were 5 steps to it. But when you look at it, the 5 steps are really 3 steps. Because Isaiah was speaking in poetry. And there's a great form of Semitic poetry that if you create a stanza with 5 lines in it, for instance, or any odd number of lines, then although you're reading it from line 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5, the sense of it goes from 1 to 5 to 2 to 4 to 3. And the climax will always be number 3. So in order to understand Semitic poetry, you have to hear it all through. Then you've got to calculate how many lines there were in it. Then you spiral in to the center, which was the climax. In other poetry, the climax comes at the end, not in Semitic poetry. So here's what Jesus, through Isaiah, was saying. "I was sent to preach good news to the poor, to declare a year of favor from the Lord." That's the same thing, that's good news. "Liberty to captives, to set prisoners free." You're jumping between these two. And then the centerpiece, the whole point would be, the climax would be to give recovery of sight to the blind. So I'm going to take those 3 pieces then. The good news piece, the freedom piece, and the recovery of sight piece. That's what Jesus is responding to, those 3 pieces. So when he's talking about preaching good news, then what is he talking about? He's talking about going beyond Lamech, obviously, who killed a boy for bruising him. Going beyond even Moses, who gave us law. Going beyond the Pharisees, who also gave us OCD, and going beyond John, who gave us asceticism, into the realization that there is a total shift in our understanding. God is not a distant, demanding deity. God is not a governor, and we the governed. God is Abba, not just Father, but Daddy, and we are the children. It's a radical shift in our understanding of the relationship between source and self. And moreover, legalism would give way to love. It will be about compassion rather than law. So Jesus is making this huge shift. That is the good news. The good news is that we're not dealing with a lawgiver and a law enforcer. We're dealing with a daddy figure who loves us and whose response to us is love, and therefore our response to each other must be that of compassion. There is the good news aspect to it. And the second piece then, the freedom. He has come to bring freedom, to set prisoners free. What does this look like? I'm always fascinated by the fact that when you look at the story of the Exodus, which is the foundation myth of Judaism, that at some stage in the year 1250 BC, God took Israel out of exile in Egypt and set them free. But it wasn't that simple. The first stage of the drama was that they had social and political freedom. Moses took them out of Egypt. And we don't realize that within 6 weeks, when you read through the book of Exodus, within 6 weeks, the Israelites actually reached the promised land. It didn't take them 40 years, only 6 weeks. And they reached the promised land, and they sent spies in to reconnoiter the terrain, one from each tribe. And these guys came in, and they looked around, they came back and said, guys, there is no way we can take this country. The people in this country, they are giants. They will eat us up. So they lost heart, and they went back into the desert, and they wandered for 40 years in the desert, until that entire generation had passed away. Because although they were sociologically they were free, and politically they were free, psychologically they were still slaves. So the second stage of freedom is psychological freedom. And that only came at the end of a generation. And then they go in, and then they begin to conquer the land. The third phase is we now have the ability to create our own agenda. But it was a freedom-seeking that enslaved and captured and killed others. That's only another stage of freedom. It's not the final stage of freedom. The ability to be so totally free that I can visit my will in others. It may represent psychological freedom and political freedom for me, but it represents death and genocide for the people I'm conquering. And so the fourth stage of freedom is the ability to realize that true freedom consists not in visiting my will upon others, but in being a bodhisattva, where my freedom equals their freedom. That in setting myself fully free, I am ipso facto setting others free as well. It is the transition from free will to freedom. Free will merely means doing as I wish. Freedom means doing as God wishes. So there's a beautiful definition in Catholic theology that freedom, that the only truly free person is the person who chooses the good. Only to the extent that I choose the good, the loving, and the compassionate am I truly free. If I think I'm free, that I can do whatever I want, I'm merely exercising free will. That is not freedom. That is only free will. If I am truly free, I will choose the good. It means I will choose not just my freedom, I will choose the freedom of everybody else that is. And so we have a long way to go in our understanding of what freedom is. There is no nation truly free that is dominating any other nation. We're only at stage 3 of a 4-stage process. So that's what Jesus meant, as far as I'm concerned, in giving freedom to those who are in prison. And then the fourth piece, recovery of sight to the blind. Now when you look at this phrase, it's very interesting. He said, I have come to give recovery of sight to the blind. That immediately suggests 3 things. It means there was a time when you were sighted, then you became blind, and thirdly, I will give you back your sight. So there are 3 stages to it. Once you were sighted, then you became blind, and now I will give you back your sight. So what did he mean by talking about once you were sighted, once you were not blind? What does that look like? As far as I'm concerned, it represents our pre-incarnational state, our post-incarnational state, and our intercarnational state. So when we live in the Bardo state, before we take on these space suits of ours, we truly see things as they are. So that happens before we incarnate, after the end of an incarnation, and between incarnations, then we are truly sighted. We see things as they are because we are in the presence of Source. But then at some stage, blindness comes in. So what is the how of blindness? How is it that blindness comes into our world or into our experience? And I suggest it happens in the following ways. That when I volunteer for mission on planet Earth, and I decide to incarnate, there are 4 immediate limitations I take on. The first one is that I have to give up cosmic consciousness in favor of a little 1350cc brain. It's like I have this huge computer that I abandon for a tiny little laptop. So that's the first limitation. That's the first reason I'm blind. The second reason is that I have to leave spacelessness, the infinity of my experience as a cosmic creature, for the confinement of a tiny little spacesuit for the first 9 months cramped into somebody's uterus. That's the second limitation. The third one is that me, for whom there is no time, who live in the eternal now, I have to substitute for that chronology. that my brain is so small that I have to divide up the gestalt of my experience into bite-sized pieces which I process sequentially, thus creating time and chronology. And fourthly, and most devastating of all, there is amnesia created in me for who I really, really, really am. I think I'm my name subsequently, or I think I'm the relationships I'm in, or I think I'm my physical body, or I think I'm in my emotional state, or I think I am my ideas, or I think I'm the job I do. And I'm none of those. I'm a spirit in a spacesuit. I'm a soul on safari on planet Earth. I'm a bite-sized piece of guide who volunteered for Earth mission. And so amnesia is created. Once amnesia has been created, there are 4 other devastating things that happen to us. When we live in a culture, what happens is this: I call it the 4 reductions. Of all the states of consciousness which we experience, we are told that only one of them is real. So in a typical day, anybody who's serious about their spiritual journey, you'll experience at least 9 states of consciousness. You'll experience waking consciousness, this grandiose title we give to what's happening right now. We experience dream state consciousness, where the rules change completely. Time, causation, and space are radically different in your dream life. We experience deep, dreamless sleep, where we're unified again with Source. We experience hypnagogic state as we're moving into that place, and hypnopompic state as we're moving out of sleep. So there's 2 more states of consciousness we experience on a regular basis. If we're serious about our spiritual journey, we will experience nature mystical consciousness. We will experience deity mystical consciousness. We will experience formless mystical consciousness, and we will experience non-dual mystical consciousness. We experience at least 9 states of consciousness in a typical day. But we're being told none of them is real except this waking one. So we've reduced, the first reduction is we've reduced all states of consciousness down to 1. Then the second reduction is we take an utterly non-representative sample of our experiences in this waking state, and we act as if they are generic and they're representative of the whole thing. Which is the reason I don't have a newspaper, I don't take a newspaper, I don't have a television set, and I don't have a radio. I do not want to be told what reality is or what's really happening out there. I'm not disputing that what's been reported isn't happening. I'm disputing that it is representative of what is happening. There is so much beauty and there is so much love and so much compassion in our world, but it is never going to make Fox News. It's not important. And so we radically reduce and take out a non-representative sample of what's happening and say, this is what's happening. And the third reduction is that it's not enough that we present you with this totally non-representative sample from a single state of consciousness. We spin it in order to present our own particular agenda. And then the fourth reduction is, and the good news is, you don't have to think. We've thought about all of this for you, and we're going to tell you what the answers are and how you need to live and behave. And basically, it's Monday night football and pizzas, or bread and circuses, as the Romans said 2,000 years ago. Panis et circenses. So that is the reason why we're blind. That is the mechanism through which we have been blinded. So how do we get beyond this? How do we break out of this? Because Jesus has promised that we were not born blind from God. We became blind through culture. How do we throw this off? And so that's my fifth point then. How do we, in the 21st century, throw off this blindness that we've experienced? Now, part of the problem is that even the message of Jesus, as is presented to his audience in his time, it is not the final journey. It is not the final stage of evolution. Jesus is speaking to an audience, and he's pushing them as far as he can, and sometimes further than they're able to go. But Jesus has to hold back as well, because there are things he cannot say to his audience and hope to have be understood in any way whatsoever. And so as he presents his style, his theory, there are three problems with it that I see. And it's because he's presenting to a group, he's pushed them so far, most of them are lost anyway. If he pushes any further, the rest of them are going to get lost. So what are the three problems that I see with the Jesus stage of evolution? And the first problem I see is it still buys into the notion of chosenness. That this God who started off as a law enforcer and then became a daddy was only a daddy to a particular group of people. And Jesus fell into this trap himself. You know, at some stage of his life, he got out of it finally, but he fell into it initially. He would say, for instance, I was only sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. In other words, my daddy only sent me to the Hebrews. In a very famous story in John's Gospel in chapter 4, he would have an encounter with a Samaritan woman, and he would say, salvation is of the Jews. You guys worship what you don't understand. We worship what we understand. For after all, salvation is from the Jews. So Jesus is still stuck as he presents his message at that stage in some kind of tribalistic thinking. Now he'll go beyond that towards the end. But initially, he's stuck there. So the problem with his position is, firstly, it still creates chosen races. There's separation between the Jews and non-Jews. The second problem is that it creates separation between human beings and other species. Now I think Jesus is beginning to move towards that, or mention this parenthetically when he says, look at the lilies of the field. They don't spin or weave or gather into barns, and yet I tell you, not even Solomon in all his finery looked as good as one of these. Look at the birds of the heaven. You guys sell them 2 for a penny in your marketplaces. There's not a single one falls from the sky without your Heavenly Father being aware of it. So Jesus is trying to push his audience towards that, but they don't get it. He's trying to push them towards a pan-species understanding of spirituality. St. Francis would pick up on that in the 1200s and push it further. It takes right down to our time before we begin to take this seriously. That spirituality and enlightenment and heaven is not about human salvation just, or individual salvation. It is about all species coming into the fullness of the knowledge of God. And then thirdly, the third difficulty with the Jesus position as articulated, which he would take most of his life to overcome himself, would be the notion that we were separate from the Father. And then finally he would get it, I and the Father are one. And that would really be the final straw for the religious authorities. That would really be the pretext for which they wanted to stone him in John chapter 6, that you, although you're a man, are making yourself out to be God. That is part of our journey. So in the 21st century, if we are serious about moving from the time of Lamech to the time of Moses, to the time of the Pharisees, to the time of John the Baptist, to the time of Jesus, to the teaching that Jesus would present if he were here today, what would that look like for us? What are the practices we might engage in order to move to the next phase of this journey? And I want to suggest maybe 5 or 6. And the first practical suggestion is meditation. A regular practice of meditation. I don't know any other practice which more powerfully allows us to disidentify with the little self and re-identify with the God center in myself and in everything else that is. That would be the first suggestion I would have. The second suggestion I would have is, as we begin to create our maps, our cosmologies, we have to use data that come to us from all states of consciousness, not just from this waking state of consciousness. Some of the most important data bits are coming from meditation, altered states of consciousness, mystical experiences, but they're not being factored into our cosmologies. They're not being factored into our political systems. They're not being factored into our economic models. They need to be. The third suggestion I would have is networking. You are not going to get this information in Fox News or even the San Jose Mercury News. You're only going to get it if you're plugged into journals and sources that are plugged in to human evolution and looking at what great stuff is happening on our planet. People like the Bioneers, which is an umbrella organization, looking at all of the ways on planet Earth that individuals and groups are trying to create what I would call Christ consciousness. Groups like the Institute of Noetic Sciences, founded by Edgar Mitchell, the Apollo 14 astronaut, where also they're looking at how do we raise Christ consciousness in law, in psychology, in agriculture, in zoology, in international diplomacy, right across the board. That would be another suggestion. A fourth suggestion would be spending quality time in nature. Nature is our greatest teacher. When we watch how nature is, that nature lives in symbiotic relationships, not in claw and tooth. It is not by competition that nature primarily lives, but rather by symbiosis, watching nature solve its problems. The fifth suggestion, I would say, is the creation of sacred time in our lives. And I know it's very difficult. People who have families and children and jobs, it is difficult. But we need to create some kind of regular sacred time in our lives. My suggestion, as it's something to aim at eventually, is that we would spend at least an hour a day in total silence alone. That we would spend at least a half a day a week in total silence alone. That we would spend a weekend a month in total silence alone. And that we would spend a week a year in total silence alone. I realize that's a very difficult move for people who have commitments and family and jobs, but to aim towards that. And my final suggestion is the creation of sacred space. There are places all over the world which in my language we call choel oitzana, thin places, where the veil between the mystical and the mundane is temporarily diaphanous. We either needed to visit such places, or we need to create that kind of space in our own living quarters. Perhaps a little corner of a room where I take off my shoes and I light incense and I burn a candle and I put a picture of my ancestors or a picture of Kuan Yin or the Virgin Mary, that I have some way of drawing myself into sacred space regularly. But in Ireland, sacred space doesn't just mean a physical location. An enlightened being is a mobile sacred space, or a mobile thin place. It is our duty as followers of Jesus Christ, if we really are serious about creating Christ consciousness, that the ideal for each one of us would be to become a mobile thin place.